Welcome to the Proceedings podcast. I'm Bill Hamblet, the editor-in-chief of Proceedings at the U.S. Naval Institute. Today is Friday, February 9th. Today's episode is brought to you by Booz Allen. Accelerate today's missions with tomorrow's technologies as the leader in providing AI solutions to the federal government and one of the world's largest cybersecurity providers. Booz Allen advances game-changing capabilities rapidly, ethically, and securely. Learn more at boozallen.com/defense. Okay, on the show today, we're going to talk about unmanned surface vessels and the International Collision Regulations, or COL regs. My guest today is Coast Guard Lieutenant J.G. Brennan Suffern. He's joining me from Charleston, South Carolina. His article is in the February issue of Proceedings, and it's titled, USVs Do Not Comply with Collision Regulations. If you have the print issue of Proceedings, you can find it starting on pages 54 and 55. Brennan, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Mr. Hamblet. Thank you for having me.
All right. Well, thank you for writing for us. And I got to start by saying kudos. You're a 2022 U.S. Coast Guard Academy graduate, so a very young officer and deck watch officer on board the Coast Guard cutter James, which is WMSL 754, one of the national security cutters. You're home ported. The ship is home ported in Charleston, South Carolina. It's always great to see such a thoughtful, well-written article from such a junior officer. So bravo. So let's start. I just got to ask, how's life on the cutter?
It's going pretty well. We're currently working through a dockside. We got back from patrol a few months ago, back in November.
Okay.
So we're just prepping for our next patrol.
And how long have you been on the ship?
Since June 2022. We graduated in May of that year, and then after a month of leave, got on the ship, and a week later we were underway.
Boom, right there. Got it. Yeah. And so you're qualified deck watch officer, all that stuff going well?
Yes, sir. Have all my required qualifications, currently pursuing some supplementary ones as well.
Nice. And what kind of missions has the ship been doing? Where you've been operating in the world?
So as a national security cutter, we specialize in maritime law enforcement. My first patrol, we went over to the South and Eastern Pacific Ocean by the Galapagos to do IUUF.
So did you go through the Panama Canal to get there? How'd you get there?
Yes, sir. We went through the canal, and then once we were down there, we were enforcing the South Pacific Regional Fisheries Management Organization, also known as SPRFMO, against squid jiggers and other fishing vessels in the area. Gotcha.
That whole IUU, that is a big mission. We interviewed Commandant Schultz on the podcast a couple of years ago when the Coast Guard launched its new IUU fishing strategy. So that was a great conversation. Well, good for you. And so it sounds like you're sort of pier side availability, doing some maintenance work now on the ship.
Yes, sir. And we're just doing your standard dockside maintenance and getting ready for patrol.
Good. All right. So let's dive into the article a little bit. So you start the article by saying USV's remote piloting configuration does not comply with the 1972 convention, specifically the lookout rule. So just start at a high level for us there.
Roger, sir. So I think just to begin, we have to understand that unmanned surface vessels do have to comply with the collision regulations. Per the COL regs, any vessel, a watercraft that's used or capable of being used to transport individuals and cargo has to comply with the regulations, even though not all unmanned vessels will possess individuals on board. They still have to comply because they're capable of having those individuals on board. And just with the lookout rule itself, the text says that every vessel shall at all times maintain a proper lookout by sight and by hearing, as well as by all available means, etc., to make full appraisal of collision situations and assess the risk of collision. And just with that, the maritime community has historically and currently view a proper lookout by sight and hearing to mean a person, an individual who has a proficiency in sighting vessels, hearing sound signals, and being able to assess the situation, make recommendations to the conning officer. And because of that, the unmanned vessels don't fall into that category.
Okay. All right. Now that's a good overview. Your article also says that because of that limitation because of the fact that there aren't lookouts on board, and oftentimes human beings on board at all. Our adversaries exploit the issue. So give some examples. I know a lot of our listeners or readers will be familiar with some of the things, but some of them may not. So just talk about how some of our adversaries have exploited that.
Sounds great, sir. So a few years ago, China had seized actually one of the Navy's unmanned surface vessels. I believe it was a sail drone, and they took it, analyzed it, and then eventually returned it when the United States requested it back. But their explanation, their reasoning for seizing the vessel was a maritime safety issue. Iran did a similar thing back in 2022. And adversaries such as these will likely continue to use such measures to seize U.S. equipment, seize military equipment, and analyze it. In the Iran case, the Navy specialist going over the vessel found that it was tinkered with. People were looking at it, and we're already having issues with China and other adversaries looking at our equipment and trying to seize U.S. innovation industry and use that to be able to propel their own military infrastructure. And this is just giving them another open window to further those goals.
Got it. So by having an unmanned vessel out there operating in their proximity, in the Persian Gulf, for example, or the South China Sea, just the fact that it doesn't comply with call regs gives them an excuse, right? It may not really be why they're seizing them and exploiting them and tinkering with them, but it's a good excuse for them to do so, because they could say, hey, look, there's this thing that the United States owns and it's operating in our contiguous waters or coastal waters or close to us, and we're concerned about safety, right? So that's it's a good point.
Yes, sorry to cut you off, sir. If I could just add as well.
Yeah, please.
There's just a precedent for following and abiding by international law. I know in terms of international maritime law, the United States has always had this controversy with UNCLOS, the fact that we see it as customary international law, but at the same time we're not a signatory, we're not fully on board. There's still controversies in that, and I know that the U.S. naval community and the international naval community have had many debates and arguments and discussions about whether U.S. should be a signatory to UNCLOS, and that's another argument that China's been using to further their own international maritime legal arguments. I know they've had issues with title of the territory and territorial seas, what are their historical waters, and the more that the United States fails to fully comply with international maritime law and various codes to that matter, that's just providing more evidence for adversaries to use for their legal arguments.
No, you bring up a very good point, and I would point out that UNCLOS, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, was the U.S. helped lead the treaty discussions that led to that agreement, right? We actually, the United States government was behind that, and then the U.S. Senate failed to ratify it. Despite the fact that, for multiple chiefs of naval operations and Coast Guard commandants in a row have said the United States should ratify this treaty, the United States has not. So we are, as you point out, the Navy and the Coast Guard, we abide by it. We act as if we are signatories to it. And we uphold it as international law. But the United States has not actually signed and ratified it through our Senate. And yet, conversely, the Chinese ratified it, right? They're signatory to UNCLOS, and yet their behavior is often, against what's in the treaty. So if you look at how the Chinese are behaving, Mischief Reef, Second Thomas Shoal, a lot of their illegal, unregulated, underreported fishing activities around the world, the way they're sort of shouldering into others around the South China Sea. While they signed the treaty, they don't abide by the treaty. So there's those different things. But you're right, they often do point to the United States as, well, you're not even a signatory to this thing, so why do I even care what you have to say about international law of the sea? So that's a really good point. Can you describe, I want to just dig into the lookout rule a little bit more in depth. And so part of your article, you talk about, these unmanned surface vessels, they tend to have camera systems, and they tend to be, they have remote operators or remote lookouts, but that's not enough to comply. Why not?
Yes, sir. So I briefly touched on the actual text of the lookout rule, and the way I break it down in the article, there's 3 main points that the lookout rule has, and 3 elements that we have to follow. The first one is it being proper, and that's kind of like what I get into with the what does the maritime community say? Because the text of the lookout rule doesn't say anything, doesn't mention an individual, a person there, and the way I view it in terms of how we read law and how we understand things, that there's some things that are implied, and the implication and the understanding through history and historical application of the lookout rule is that a lookout is a person that's properly trained. I know in the Navy and the Coast Guard and other naval and maritime organizations, there's certain competencies and a qualification test that you have to take in order to qualify and certify as a lookout. There are certain boards, tests. You have to have a certain degree of knowledge and experience and just ability to be able to be a lookout.
Yep.
And from what I see, like the Navy and the Coast Guard, we continue to use lookouts. We continue to have qualified, trained people up on the bridge maintaining that watch. And I know that from personal experience, I know that the Navy and the Coast Guard, we have certain capabilities that fulfill that remote lookout obligation, like a camera or a microphone. At the same time, we're still using lookouts to comply with that rule. The second part is
so let me just footnote that or foot stomp that. A proper lookout is what it says in the call regs. You must have a proper lookout.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
So the second part I have is that has to be continuous, or the way it says in the text, at all times. So technology is great. Technology is advancing. It's getting better every day, every hour, every minute. At the same time, there's always that ability for the technology to fail us. And again, being on a cutter, seeing like parts fail in real time. They're still getting better. We're always improving, but it's going to fail at some point. And the ability to have technicians and people there to fix it at a moment's notice when it let's say when it breaks or it falters at some point is critical. And in the Coast Guard, we have those people. They're on deck. They're ready to go in the engine rooms, up on the bridge. They're at the ready. But if you have an unmanned vessel, no people, something breaks, you can't just have someone hop on and fix it. It'll take time. And if it's something critical, let's say propulsion or navigation, or even the satellite communication to be able to see and hear what's going on, there's that window for error that's dangerous and a general safety issue.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think your article also brings up the fact that even with a remote operator with the camera system, and somebody at the controls remotely, what happens if you lose communications, right? What happens if you lose that satellite uplink, and you're particularly in a busy waterway, the South China Sea or the Strait of Hormuz or something, and suddenly that remote operator can't see through the camera, can't react. There's no lookout there. There's nobody on board, and so you've lost that ability to actually monitor and be aware of the situation. Talk about also collision avoidance and liability, because those are issues that come up in this discussion as well.
Yes, sir. So the whole reason that we have collision regulations, the reason there's a lookout rule in the first place, is to avoid collision, to maintain general safety on in the high seas and all waters. And with the unmanned surface vessel, it has some capability of avoiding collision as long as everything's all right. The remote operator's there, aware of the situation, able to do everything. But at the same time, like we were talking about previously, if something happens, if something goes wrong, there's a lot less ability for them to avoid collision, especially if they're in the position in accordance with the rules that they have to give way if they're the ones responsible to avoid collision. And with my prior experience as a deck watch officer or professional mariner, timing is everything. Time is everything. You can't really delay anything at all. And with it, even if everything's working well, there's going to be a slight delay that you would have with a remote operator or an autonomous vessel versus having someone who's there on the bridge, seeing everything, able to react at a moment's notice.
Yeah, that's a great point. So your article, like all good articles, identifies a problem, describes the problem very well in depth, and then you offer recommendations or options on how to proceed. So let's discuss those. You got 3 in your article. The first one is man the unmanned. So in other words, put people, probably a minimal crew on unmanned vessels. Describe that a little bit.
So that's actually happening right now. Rear Admiral, I hope I'm saying this right, Rear Admiral Moden, the former program executive officer of unmanned systems, he already remarked, I think I really got the words here, that they already have technicians on those vessels, like ready at a moment's notice to make those fixes, make those critical parts exchanges, and to, in his words, handle those things that are just not quite there with maneuvering. And if we maintain that and continue that, one will be able to ensure that the vessel is able to be repaired and fully operational the whole time. Second, if they have that lookout watch in the rotation up on the bridge or wherever on the vessel, they'll still be in compliance with that rule, because they'll have the person there qualified, standing the watch. The one issue I have with that is that it's really taking away the what the vessel is made to do. It's an unmanned vessel is made to be unmanned and reduce the fatigue and wear on human crews and reduce the necessity for human placement there.
Right, right. And in the case of high-end warfare, unmanned vessels are increasingly looked at as warfighting platforms that you can put in places where the risk is high, where the threat environment is very high. So if you have to put sailors on board, that sort of negates that advantage of having an unmanned thing that is, of course, less dear to lose, right?
Yes, sir. And I would also add that while the collision regulations, they're great and all, they were made in a time where we didn't have this capability of having unmanned vessels.
Yep.
And everything. And
yep.
Well, that's great. We need to just add. We can always add more laws and regulations that fit the vessels while ensuring that the safety and the goal of the original laws remain.
Yeah, if you look at some of the very small USVs, like Sail Drone is one. In fact, that's one of the pieces of equipment that the Iranians seized in the Persian Gulf. But others that they're using out there in Task Force 59 in the Persian Gulf, in the Fifth Fleet area of operations, a lot of these are really small. You couldn't put a person on board, or if you could, you certainly couldn't support them for days on end, right? These are not big enough to have a galley, a head, sleeping quarters, those kinds of things. So on the small ones, even if they're 5-10 meters, you're not talking about the ability to have a 3-person, 4-person crew that could provide that mandatory 24/7 lookout.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Okay. So second option that you talk about is continue without notice. So that's kind of like, let's keep doing what we're doing. What are the advantages and disadvantages of that?
Well, the advantage is that we don't really have to change our program. Like, we're just going to keep steaming ahead, no change, just keep doing that, and no additional investment needed, no additional efforts or expenditures from that. So I would say those are the pros from that. The cons, though, is twofold. One is that we'll still be seen as potentially like illegitimate and going against regulations, and that can hurt our professional credibility in the maritime community.
Yep.
Second is, and I get that more into the why it matters, is that without the U.S. being involved, invested, we don't have a voice in what's happening in the future. And I would certainly caution against that, because as I wrote in the article, if our voice isn't at the table, then whatever result comes in, we might not be so pleased with what happens.
Yeah, it's either if the United States doesn't take a leadership role, then be careful what you might get out the other end, right? You might be what comes out of international law, if you're not involved in making international law, might be something that's not suitable to U.S. national interests. Yeah, it's a good point. And to your opening points, our adversaries may continue to do what they're doing, right? They just keep seizing these things. Yeah. Okay, and the third option is promote new rules. So, in your mind, what does that look like?
It's actually happening in the international maritime community today, sir. I believe the Australians are working on their own framework for bringing USVs into the maritime domain. And Admiral Moden actually reached out to me, and he provided me a very nice article from the International Maritime Organization, the IMO. And they're developing their own code to place unmanned vessels in the global maritime infrastructure.
Oh,
and
okay.
They actually categorize it. I have it right here. They categorize the vessels into 4 degrees. The first 2 having remote seafarers on board with some degree of involvement in the operation and maintenance of the vessels. Whereas as you get to the 3rd and 4th degree, they become more autonomous, with the 3rd degree being nobody on board, they have a remote operator, and then the 4th and final degree being a fully autonomous ship. From what I've read, they're not fully in terms of developing a framework similar to the coal regs for unmanned vessels. I'd say they're on their way, and the United States should invest as much as possible in promoting that and being involved.
Gotcha. Okay, that's interesting. So we're running a little short on time here. So let's wrap this up with, why does it matter?
I think I'll just hitting the same point again. The United States, it has a deep investment in the global maritime community. And part of that is all the rules and regulations we have to follow. And so the United States has in the past and currently tries to maintain that global hegemon over like the maritime domain, being involved. And I would argue we should keep doing that, investing in the future and promoting that. Otherwise, we're going to be left in the dust and might be succeeded as a global naval power.
Yeah, I'll put stump. One thought that I think you're having, or that you get to in the article, which is, we hear a lot about the international rules-based order. We hear about how important it is to set rules and then obey the rules, right? To abide by the rules. And if you look at what the Navy's doing right now to protect international shipping in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden and the approaches to the Suez Canal, there are obviously organizations, bad actors, and countries that are looking to upset the international rules. And if we don't set the right example, then it's awfully hard to get the world to follow. And you may end up with an international set of norms that becomes not to our liking, very much not to our liking, and not to our national interests. So this is a great discussion. I'm really glad. We read your article. A lot of articles get edited pretty heavily. Your article got very light edits. It was very well written and very clear in terms of, here's the problem statement, here's what's going on, and here are some things that we can do about it. I think this is going to be maybe you're not starting the conversation, but you're certainly adding to it in a significant way. I'm really glad to hear that the Admiral reached out to you. So he read your article and then reached out.
Yes, sir.
That's fantastic. Yeah, that's the kind of impact that we hope Proceedings articles will have. That's really great. What are you hearing from your Coast Guard commanders up your chain of command on the ship, or in the broader Coast Guard?
Concerning the article, sir?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Captain Allen, I think he's the chief of emerging policy, also reached out to me, and again, he was really just harping on the importance of us maintaining that professional credibility, that legitimacy in the international maritime order, and just having good faith, following the rules, being a part and involved and really invested in what the rules is and having that, as you said, the rules-based order. And that we espouse to do that all the time. We just need to follow through with it.
Right. It also, this reminded me, your article reminded me of the debate that's going on in the United States with the, transportation, Department of Transportation and safety about driverless cars on the highway, right? What do we do with the Tesla, fully autonomous capability? And people are not, and there are collisions all the time with human beings behind the wheel. But people are really unsettled by the idea that a robot is driving a car and might cause an accident or might, kill a pedestrian. And so it's important to get not just the technology right, but also to get the legal structure around it right. And in this case, it's not just U.S. highways that we're concerned about, but the international waterways and oceans of the world. So it does involve an international community and involves a bigger conversation.
Yes, sir. If I may add just one more thing.
Please.
Your discussion got me thinking just with the idea of liability. And with admiralty law, a lot of it comes to liability. Whose fault is it if a collision happens? And let's say, God forbid, there's a collision with an unmanned vessel. And in the investigation, there was an issue with the communications or some kind of the camera. Who's at fault? Is it the company that installed the camera? Is it the producer? Was it the remote operator? Was it the corporation or the naval force at large? Those are some really interesting and complex questions that a codified, very in-depth framework would allow and make it much easier to introduce unmanned vessels into the maritime domain, sir.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. The liability part of it, and if we're increasingly going to build a remote pilotless unmanned surface vessel fleet out there, right? At some point there will be collisions. It's just inevitable. And who's held liable? And wouldn't it be terrible if the United States had things, the United States Navy or Coast Guard, had a vehicle out there that caused a collision at sea that resulted in loss of life, and we hadn't worked through these issues, because suddenly you'd have to work through all of them, and it would be in hindsight, and it would be probably more painful to do it in hindsight. It's a great point. Well, before we sign off, any saved rounds or last thoughts from you?
I think the only big thing I would say is that the origins of the article and my ideas surrounding it actually came from a class at the academy. When I was a first class cadet, so a senior, I took my rowing coach's cyber ethics and policy course. And in the midst of that course, a visiting speaker was chatting with us about the scenario with, let's say, the Block Island ferry coming in. It's now fully autonomous. It just goes from point A to point B. It just keeps going straight, doesn't avoid anybody, just goes in a straight direction, and it hits a recreational vessel. Who's at fault? We had this in-depth conversation about the rules of the road. Like, do they actually have to comply with it as an unmanned vessel? Is like all the different questions and topics we were talking about were in the class, and that's what got my brains going. So I would certainly say that the service academies and just like the maritime universities as a whole is a wonderful opportunity to spark conversations and continue the discussions.
Oh, that's a great point. The nexus between operations and technology and ethics and law all coming together. These are, as some would call them, wicked problems or very complex problems, and things that definitely require thinking about, working through. And it's not just a technological solution, but it's a human solution as well. And you brought all those things up very well in your article. And so congratulations and thanks for writing for us. So we'll get signed off here. My guest today has been Coast Guard Lieutenant J.G. Brennan Suffern. His article in the February issue of Proceedings is titled USVs Do Not Comply with Collision Regulations. Brennan, thanks for writing for Proceedings and for being on the show.
Yeah, thank you for having me, sir.
All right. Today's show was brought to you by Booz Allen. Accelerate today's missions with tomorrow's technologies as the leader in providing AI solutions to the federal government and one of the world's largest cybersecurity providers. Booz Allen advances game-changing capabilities rapidly, ethically, and securely. Learn more at boozallen.com/defense. And until next episode, remember, victory begins at the Naval Institute.